He stood there, staring at the building he built from nothing. The Apple logo was glowing above him. But this time, it wasn't his anymore. You ever built something and then watched someone else take it from you? That's what happened to Steve Jobs. The man who made Apple got kicked out of Apple. Crazy, right? But it gets even crazier when you find out how it happened. Because this wasn't just business. It was betrayal by someone he trusted like a brother. Before that day, Steve wasn't just a boss. He was a dreamer. A kid with messy hair, barefoot most of the time, who dropped out of college but still sneaked into classes because he loved learning. He didn't have money. He didn't even have a bed for a while. But he had one thing, a dream to make computers that anyone could use, not just scientists or companies, but normal people. Back in the 1970s, Steve and his best friend Steve Wozniak worked in a small garage in California. That garage became their whole world. They stayed up all night building tiny computers that no one believed in. When people said, "Who would ever want a computer in their house?" Steve said, "Everyone will." That's how Apple started. Two young guys in a tiny garage, no money, no fancy degrees, no plan. Just this crazy belief that they could change the world with something made out of wires, screens, and plastic. Every night, while the rest of the neighborhood slept, they sat under a single light bulb, surrounded by the smell of metal and solder, building something no one had ever seen before. Steve Jobs was a dreamer, the one who talked about the future like it was already here. And Steve Wozniak, was a quiet genius who could make that future real. Their parents' garage became their office, their lab, and their dream factory all in one. They didn't have desks, they worked on the floor. They didn't have investors. They sold Woz's calculator and Steve's van just to buy parts. Every screw, every chip, every little detail mattered to them. When they finished building their first computers, they loaded them into Steve's old car and drove from shop to shop, trying to convince people to buy them. Most said no. Some laughed. One store finally said yes, but only if they could deliver 50 units. Steve said, "You got..." Even though they had no money, no workers, and no factory, they went home and worked for days straight. Friends helped. Neighbors dropped by with food. They built each computer by hand, one after another, until their fingers hurt. And when they finally delivered those 50 machines, Apple Computer was born. At first, nobody took them seriously. The big companies laughed at the idea of home computers. They said computers were for businesses, not kids. They said regular people would never need one, but Steve didn't care. He kept saying, "Someday, every home will have a computer." People thought he was dreaming, and he was. But sometimes, dreams are just ideas waiting for their time. Then came the Apple II, bright, colorful, and friendly. It wasn't a gray box filled with blinking lights. It looked alive. It felt personal. For the first time, technology didn't feel cold or complicated. It felt human. Kids loved it. Schools bought it. Families saved up to get one. And it sold like crazy. Almost overnight, Apple went from a two-man garage project to one of the fastest growing companies in America. Steve Jobs, who just a few years before was eating free meals at a temple and sleeping on friends' floors, was suddenly a millionaire. People couldn't get enough of him. Reporters called him a genius. Magazines put his face on the cover. He wore jeans and sneakers to meetings while everyone else wore suits, and that made him even cooler. But success does weird things to people. The company that once felt like a small family was now a giant machine with hundreds of employees, investors, and board members. Everyone wanted a piece of Apple, and not everyone liked how Steve ran things. By 1983, Apple was huge, and so was Steve Jobs' fame. People saw him as a rock star, but inside the company, whispers started. Some said he was too demanding, too controlling, too intense. They loved his vision, but they were afraid of his fire, and that tension would soon change everything. See, Steve was intense. If he didn't like your idea, he'd tell you straight to your face, sometimes yelling, sometimes silent. One engineer said working for him felt like jumping out of a plane and trying to build a parachute before you hit the ground. Some people couldn't handle it, but those who stayed said he made them better. Still, the board thought he was too young to lead, too emotional, too much like a kid with a big toy. So they convinced him to bring in a real CEO, someone with experience, someone who could manage the company like a grown-up. That's when Steve met John Scully, the man running Pepsi at the time. A smooth talker, smart, calm, the kind of guy who always wore perfect suits. Steve saw something in him. He wanted a partner who could help him take Apple to the next level. One night, Steve Jobs stood on a hotel balcony, the city lights of New York glittering below like a million tiny stars. He was only in his 20s, barefoot, wearing his usual black turtleneck and jeans, but his mind was already miles ahead, thinking about the future, about Apple, about what it could become. Beside him stood John Scully, the polished president of PepsiCo, a man who had spent years selling soft drinks, living the comfortable corporate life. Steve had been trying for weeks to convince him to leave everything and join Apple. Scully looked out at the skyline, quiet, unsure. Why would he leave a billion-dollar company to work for a group of young dreamers in California? It didn't make sense. But Steve had one more card to play. He turned to Scully and asked, calmly but with fire in his eyes, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" That line hit hard. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge, a dare to dream bigger. Scully felt something shift inside him. In that moment, he realized Steve wasn't just selling computers. He was selling the future. And so he said yes. For a while, everything was perfect. Steve and Scully became a powerhouse duo. Steve was a dreamer, wild, creative, unpredictable, the one who believed that computers could be as beautiful as art. Scully was a businessman, calm, disciplined, polished, the one who could turn Steve's wild visions into something that could sell. Together, they were unstoppable. They poured their energy, money, and hearts into one single mission: to create the Macintosh, a computer that wasn't just powerful but personal. Steve wanted it to be friendly, to smile when you turn it on, to make people feel something. He wanted it to speak, to show pictures, to make people believe that technology could be joyful. Every detail mattered: the design, the sound, even the box it came in. Steve pushed the team so hard that some cried, others quit, but those who stayed believed they were part of history. When the Macintosh was finally ready, Apple hosted one of the most legendary launches the tech world had ever seen. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and on the big screen, the Macintosh introduced itself with a voice that said, "Hello, I'm Macintosh." The crowd went wild. People screamed, clapped, even cried. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Steve Jobs stood on stage, eyes gleaming, soaking it all in. In that moment, Apple felt untouchable, like nothing could stop them. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. As Apple grew, so did the tension. Steve wanted perfection, no matter the cost. Scully wanted stability, strategy, and control. The two men who once saw the world the same way were now seeing two very different futures. And slowly, the dream that brought them together began to tear them apart. The Macintosh didn't sell as well as they hoped. It was expensive. It was slow. And while Steve wanted to keep pushing, Scully wanted to play it safe. Meetings turned into arguments. Arguments turned into shouting. The board started picking sides. And slowly, they stopped listening to Steve. One day, Steve walked into a board meeting, barefoot, confident as always, but this time, something was off. Everyone was quiet. Papers were neatly stacked. Faces were serious. Steve looked around and said, "What's going on?" John Scully looked up and said calmly, "We're making some changes." Steve frowned. "Changes?" Scully said, "You're no longer in charge of the Macintosh team." It hit him like a punch to the chest. He looked around, waiting for someone to say it was a joke. No one did. The company he built had just taken his power away. That night, long after everyone had gone home, Steve sat alone in his office. The once busy halls of Apple were silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside his window, the city lights blurred through the glass, glowing dots of color that seemed distant and cold. On the wall behind him, the Apple logo glowed faintly in the dark, like a ghost of everything he built. The desk in front of him was scattered with papers, Old sketches, memos, and photos from the early days in the garage. He picked one up, a picture of him in Wozniak smiling beside the first Apple computer. For a moment, he smiled too, a small, tired smile, before setting it back down. The office, once filled with energy and ideas, now felt like a graveyard. The door creaked open gently, and his assistant stepped in hesitant. Clutching a stack of folders she didn't really need to deliver, she looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Steve, what are you going to do now?" For a few seconds, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, shoulders heavy, eyes fixed on the floor. This was a man who had dreamed of changing the world, who had convinced thousands to believe in his vision. And now his own company had pushed him out. He took a deep breath, swallowed hard, and said quietly, almost to himself, "I guess I'm going to start over." There was no anger in his voice, no shouting, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from losing something you gave your whole soul to. His assistant nodded slowly, not knowing what to say. She turned and left, closing the door behind her. The room went silent again. Steve leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He could still see flashes of the past. The garage, the first computers, the cheering crowd at the Macintosh launch. It all felt so far away now. You ever been so heartbroken that you can't even cry? When the pain is too deep to come out as tears, and all you can do is sit there and feel it. That's where he was. Not angry, not bitter, just broken. But even in that silence, something inside him refused to die. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was belief, maybe it was that tiny spark that had always made him different. The voice that whispered, "This isn't the end." He didn't know it yet, but that quiet, painful night, sitting alone in that dark office, was the beginning of something new. The news spread fast. Apple fires Steve Jobs. Headlines mocked him. Investors laughed. People whispered, "He's finished." But the thing about people like Steve Jobs, you can knock them down, but you can't kill their fire. A few months later, he started a new company. He called it Next. It wasn't just a company. It was his way of saying, "I'm not done yet." He built a small team of loyal people, dreamers like him. They worked in silence, building black cube computers that were way ahead of their time. But the world didn't understand Next. The computers were too expensive. They didn't sell much. Still, Steve kept going. Then something unexpected happened. He bought a small animation studio from George Lucas. Yeah, the Star Wars guy. He called it Pixar. People laughed again. Steve Jobs making cartoons, they said, but he saw something no one else did. He believed animation could be made with computers. Years later, Pixar released its first movie, Toy Story. It broke every record. It changed the animation world forever. While Apple was struggling, Steve was quietly building the future, one piece at a time. By 1996, Apple was in trouble, really bad trouble. Their computers were boring. Microsoft was beating them. The company was losing money fast. So guess who they called? Steve Jobs. The man they threw out came back to save them. When he walked into Apple's offices again, people went silent. Some felt guilty, some were scared. But Steve wasn't angry. He just smiled and said, "Let's make this company great again." And he did. He cut down all the useless projects. He focused the company on a few things that really mattered. He said, "We're not going to make a lot of products. We're going to make a few insanely great ones." And he meant it. Then came the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. Each one changed how we live, how we talk, how we work, how we connect. Apple didn't just come back. It became the most valuable company in the world. And the man who once got fired for not being good enough became the legend that changed technology forever. You see, if he hadn't been fired, there might never have been a Pixar, no Next, no iPhone. That moment that broke him actually built him. Years later, Steve said something that stuck with me. Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. Sometimes losing everything is how you find yourself. He came back wiser, kinder, more focused. He started saying things like, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. He knew what it meant to fail. He knew what it meant to start again. And maybe that's the real story. Not about computers, not about money, but about falling down and getting back up stronger than ever. Because no matter who you are, if you've ever felt left out, rejected, or forgotten, remember Steve Jobs. He was fired from the company he built, laughed at, counted out, and still, he changed the world. So next time life pushes you out of your own dream, don't give up. You might just be in the middle of your comeback story. If you believe that sometimes getting kicked out is just life pushing you towards something bigger, subscribe.